numbers that people tend to get, oh, why are we doing this? Many of you here are not regular attenders at Los Ranchos Presbytery and may not be aware of a significant change that started evolving last fall, where the finance team of the Presbytery is really taking a fresh look at the finances. And a fresh look starts by getting some understanding of history. That's been very difficult for a variety of reasons. The biggest reason is that we had an old accounting system 3 or 4 years ago, migrated it over to a new software package. And when the database was migrated, that was supposed to go like this, it went like that. And there's been a great deal of manual work that's been done to get our arms around the financial history and the data. Other factors have influenced it besides that, one of which is, think of your household account. You have a checking account, you have a savings account. And Los Ranchos has, over the years, budgeted all the money that went through the checking account, but the savings account over there was sort of off budget. We're bringing that into the process, as you'll see later here. So let's start with a little bit of an overview about who are we as a presbytery. You know, we're 39 congregations that have over 100 members, and there are another 12 to 15 that have less than 100 members. We've got about 14 new worshiping communities. Most of them are small, under 100, and more typically they're 40 to 70. But in the aggregate, we have about 18,000 members. You can see the demographics up on the, oh, we need the slide up. Pardon. Used to having a clicker, thank you. We don't have the clicker. But you can see how the spread is across the demographics, at least by members. And then down at the bottom, what is the impact of dismissal if all 10 of the discerning congregations departed? It's 37% of our members, and it's about 1/3 of our net income. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no family, no business enterprise, no church, no presbytery that can lose 1/3 of its income and not feel some pain. Let's move on to the next slide and talk about what's been happening financially within Los Ranchos pre-dismissal. And that is that our net income has gone down by more than $100,000 in the last couple of years. Local churches support Los Ranchos 2 ways: per capita, general mission. Per capita is kind of formalized, general mission is more discretionary. Both of those have portions which are upstream from Los Ranchos to General Assembly. So the amounts shown on that top line are the net amount of those that are retained inside of Los Ranchos. At the same time, our operating expenses have gone up by over $100,000. Of course, that, income down, expenses up. That means some operating deficits. Post-dismissal, we're dealing with nearly $500,000 of deficit on $1.5 million budget. It's a big number. And the next slide shows you some of the details. It's a lot of numbers that really support the big picture. It shows you by per capita and general mission over a spread of years where the money comes in, and then down at the bottom, the administrative operating expenses. Let me stop and define that term. Administrative operating expenses consists of, it's about a $900,000 number. About 2/3 of that are the staff salaries and the directly related expenses, pensions, healthcare, that sort of thing. And the other $300,000 goes across the funding of our several committees. Commission on Ministry, Committee on Preparation for Ministries, and then the trustees. And some of the trustees have had some large expenses. For example, when there's a shortfall and a church is not able to pay its per capita, the presbytery still has to upstream that amount, so it becomes a trustee expense. Trustees also have some property expenses in there. But you can see that bottom line where the deficits have been increasing in recent years, and then it gets much larger post-dismissal. So let's go to the next slide, please, and we'll see that some big picture concepts here. The total expense is about $1.5 million. More than 2/3 of that are the operating expenses, and the other $600,000 is program expenses. Bear with me, we'll get into a little bit more detail on what our program expenses. That's going to be the orange sheet that you'll have available in the back. But let me make a comment about what is New Church Development and how much money does Los Ranchos dedicate to that. About half of the program expense goes to New Church Development, and that would be things like New Hope in Orange, which is an Afro-American congregation. It would be things like the village out in Ladera Ranch. It is a mix of 9 or 10 mostly ethnic minority congregations that are housed inside of existing brick and mortar churches. It would be things like the Canvas Ministry, which has kind of taken off fairly quickly in Irvine. These are new church developments or struggling churches that we're trying to help get going. So if that's where the money goes, if that's where the $1.5 million goes, let's take a look at the bottom slide and say, well, where does the money come from? Well, per capita general mission, you're probably fairly familiar with. But transfers from dedicated and restricted accounts is where a lot of that money comes from. For example, New Hope in Orange, Afro-American congregation, is funded primarily from something that's called Long Beach Fund. It was a church in Compton that didn't make it, the property was sold, and that was an Afro-American church. That's where that funding comes from. Another example would be Joining Hearts and Hands, is where the Ladera Ranch, the village ministry, has been funded from. So transferring money basically out of our savings account over here in these dedicated accounts and moving it over to the checking account, funding them. We also have investment income that has been running a little under $100,000 a year. We're trying to improve the management of that. I think that we can get better returns. There's a program in place to get that investment return up to maybe $200,000 or $250,000. And then we have some grants that come from outside organizations. The largest of which was a $200,000 grant received in 2011 and $1,200,000 each year from the Synod. And then there was a $50,000 grant received from the Walton Foundation. So sometimes we get money that comes in from outside. Moving on to the next slide, please, we'll see that what are the two expense categories? What are the line items that make up operating expense and program expense? You can read them up on the screen. I'm not going to articulate them to you. But let me just make a comment that may be relevant. I've been kind of hanging around Presbytery for a while. Until a year ago, my identity was not Bill Peck, it was Lynn Stone's dad. And some of you may know our daughter, Lynn Stone's a pastor, currently serving down at Temecula. The point is, I went to a lot of Presbyterian meetings, and I really didn't have much of a sense for what really was happening. And I'm a financial person. I read what a business does. Give me your checkbook. I'll tell you where your priorities are. And getting some insight into Los Ranchos' checkbook, it really opened my eyes to just how much ministry is done. You'll see the detail in the orange sheet when we get into the program ministry. How many and how varied are the ministries that are supported in our program expense category? And by the way, Tom Kramer's done an excellent job of pulling together this detail, and Lydia would be another great person, Lydia Sarrington, for you to address any questions that you might have as to what's in the meat and the substance of these programs. So moving on quickly, you've seen the next slide in the larger chart, and that just shows you where the expenses have been in the various, what we call the administrative or the operating side, different from the program side. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see that the more of the detail, the history of what each of the components of the program expense has been. And certainly during the question and answer period, if you want to address any questions to any of these line items, we've got the resources primarily in Tom and Lydia to address those. And then move on to the next slide. We'll talk about what have these expenses averaged by category over the last 4 years, and it's about 650,000. And the new worshiping communities are about half of that. Los Ranchos Presbytery has had a negative cash flow, cash burn rate, if you were in the business world, that term might be appropriate, of something between $500,000 and $600,000 a year. It's important to note that half of that, this top line, this $300,000 of new worshiping community, if we weren't investing that money, Los Ranchos would not be doing its job. That money from a sale of a particular church property that's funding New Hope, the sale of, or the Joining Hearts and Hands, if that money wasn't going out, Los Ranchos wouldn't be doing its job. So when you see some big negative cash flow numbers, realize that part of it's intentional. The money that's been raised isn't just to sit in an account and gain interest in investment income. It's intended to be put into ministry. So bear that in mind in terms of the total picture of Los Ranchos. Now, moving on to the next slide, you can see just how big the operating deficits in Los Ranchos have been historically, and averaging well over $500,000 a year. The financial evaluation of Los Ranchos has not been precipitated by this dismissal process. That is not the cause of this. We needed to get our arms as a presbytery around our finances, and we didn't have our arms. The trustees really didn't have our arms around it like we should. So starting about a year ago, we've taken a very in-depth look at the financials of Los Ranchos, and we're in the process of creating a multi-year, 3-year, 5-year strategic plan that lays out the various steps in ministry. And we've been meeting twice a month for, I don't know, since last fall sometime. I'm getting well acquainted with the Presbytery office. We've brought in a resource. Tom brought in a CPA that's very sharp, that's working with us. He's from the village ministry. And we started out with first a team of 3, which were 3 trustees putting together a budget, and then we transitioned to a team of 4, and we now have a team of 5 that are working on this, and that team of 5 is Lanny, myself, Steve, Tom, and Forrest, and we're meeting every other week to really evolve good history financially, to make solid projections going forward, where the ministry will drive the money. It's not the other way around. So let's move on to the next slide and say, okay, what have we been doing historically to cover these deficits? Well, the first thing that happened was in 2011, Presbytery as a whole, in response to recognizing we had some negative cash flow problems, we had to deal with it. There's a fund called Property and Investment Fund that's funded by the sale of church properties. And we'll come to what that covers in a bit. So the first step was in 2011 to move money, $500,000 out of that fund, basically move the money out of the savings account, put it over in the checking account to cover expenses. We really didn't, as a presbytery, get our arms around the financial issues for a couple of years. So last fall, had to move another $500,000 over, and that was sort of a coming together, a change in the climate, in the management, if you will, of the presbytery, where the Financial Futures Task Force was part of making that recommendation. The trustees were part of making that recommendation. We brought it together with council, and those 3 entities collaborated in a very cooperative manner, which hasn't always been the case for some of those of you who've been to some of the Presbyterian meetings. And I'd like to think there's a new spirit of collaboration, cooperation on financial matters within the Presbytery. But that's how we've been covering the deficits. And then the third point is what I alluded to earlier with what we now call the team of 5 and formerly the team of 4 that was addressing that. So the next slide will show you, next slide, please. Where did we get the non-recurring income? We basically have had sale of church properties, 3 church properties, $4.3 million. That's where the money in the property and investment fund came from. And then we had the $250,000 of other money that came in, and of course some money will probably come in from dismissals out of the work that you are doing. Don't know how much that is yet, but it will likely go into that fund because it's likely to be treated much like the sale of church properties. So the next slide shows you some of the restrictions that we have on roughly $6 million in assets. There have been several questions that have come to the trustees saying, well, what is the financial condition of Los Ranchos Presbytery, and what limited information was available? Basically, it's older information. The last time we had completed a financial review by Starr & Walters was 2011, and we got really tangled up in the software conversion I mentioned earlier. Made it very difficult to get the numbers. We've just now submitted the paperwork for 2012, and once we get 12, it's just a matter of a couple of months after that till we'll have 13 as well. Yes, Los Ranchos has a lot of cash, about $6 million. But as I mentioned earlier, much of that is in dedicated funds and not available for operations, except as the Willa Presbytery moves the money out of that to cover operations, as they did in 2011, as they did in 2013. A lot of those funds are restricted. The amount that's not restricted is only about $1.5 million. So let's move forward to the next slide and talk about what are we doing for budgeting in 2014. Basically, it's stay the course. We are in a transition both in membership, and we are in a transition with regard to financial matters. So let's say one high priority we all agreed on is maintain the staff stability through this period. Secondly, the assumption is whatever financial impact comes to Los Ranchos as a result of the discernment, it's not going to hit in 2014. The impact will be 2015. And also stay the course on the program ministry. Part of that is the release of funds from dedicated accounts for new church development. And we've got a strong enough balance sheet that Los Ranchos is not going to run out of cash anytime soon, but we are very aware that we have to make some of those difficult decisions. And some of those difficult decisions on program and funding, we have to make those decisions even if the discernment process were not going on. But the discernment process does exacerbate it, makes the problem bigger, and it brings a new sense of urgency to addressing these financial problems. So the next slide will show you a little bit about what the trustees have recommended be done. I think we're probably going to have to reduce total expenses by somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000 each year for 3 years. Big picture, get our expenses down from somewhere around $1.5 million down to around $1 million. It's not going to be easy. And that means we're going to have to look carefully at reductions in both the operating expenses and in the program expenses. Our goal is to have a balanced budget within 3 years, and we're also exploring ways to increase income with some, I would call, low-hanging fruit, like getting a higher investment return on the money that we have in accounts. So the next slide will talk a little bit more about the financial future and the strategic planning of that. It'll lead primarily the strategic coordinating team to do a careful evaluation of each new church development, evaluate their prospects for growth. Will they grow to become financially independent, and will they also mature to have the elder deacon kind of infrastructure that needs to be for the church to be self-sustaining? One of the things I realized when I got into the Presbytery office is how much financial accounting is done by the staff of Presbytery for these churches. These emerging churches don't have a financial secretary or equivalent to manage the resources. A number of the payrolls for those churches are handled in the Presbytery office. You don't get a sense for what does it take to make a new church development work. You just kind of think on the surface, but once you dig down and underneath, say, I got to have some of the basic operational stuff like handling the accounting. Another program is meeting with churches that are struggling. I'm just going to share a little bit of my heart with you right now. I've been meeting at the Presbytery office frequently for 6 months or more. It's in Anaheim. I walk into that nice, beautiful building, classic architecture, flying buttresses. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's just a beautiful piece of architecture. And nice courtyard, and then great buildings associated with it. And then there's the third building, which is where the preschool is, and in the basement of that building is the offices for Los Ranchos Presbytery. It's a block, if you will, from the main intersection in downtown Anaheim, home of Disneyland. A couple of days ago, I got there a little bit early and I drove around the surrounding neighborhood. The urban renewal that is going on within walking distance of that church, it's great. There's some older buildings, smaller buildings that have been, we'd say in appraisal terms, technically obsolete. They're being torn down, and what's coming in to replace it are some really nice condos and apartment buildings. And this is not low-income housing. This is kind of upscale. The congregation in that Anaheim church is, 60 or 80 people in worship, maybe? And mostly an older congregation. And what do? It's just got this beautiful facility, and it's got this neighborhood that probably doesn't have a lot of people that are churched. So, Los Ranchos has this program called New Beginnings. And corner Tom somewhere and ask him about what's happening with New Beginnings. There are a dozen churches that are going through this to say, rationalize, what do we do with this church property? Or how can we revitalize this congregation? In this case, there are 12 of them that we're talking to. That's the kind of thing that most people don't see what Los Ranchos does. There's another side to that too. Does anybody care to guess what's the fastest growing church measured by membership in Los Ranchos Presbytery? Anybody have an idea? St. Mark. St. Mark is also going through New Beginnings, because New Beginnings isn't just for churches that are in somewhat of a desperate situation, but the fastest growing church in our denomination is also in that program. It's a great program. I encourage you to talk with Tom about it. I'm a little bit off subject, so, by the way, I gave Forrest permission before I got here. I said, Forrest, if I wander off and I get off the reservation, you just get to look out and pull him back, okay?
You're not off the reservation as far as content. However, I do think we might need to push on.
Okay.
How close are you to being finished with your presentation?
1 minute.
Do it.
Okay. You've seen that slide. You know what we're doing. The next slide is the last slide. And it just talks about how much we have to reduce our expenses. So, thus ends my sermon.
Thanks. Pulse of the room again. Based on what you've heard now, do you find yourself with new questions such that we should take another 3 to 5 minute interval with the index cards? Show me your hands if you're in that place. Okay, hands up if you want a couple minutes to frame new questions on the index cards. In other words, you're ready to move forward. All right, if you do have questions, we're going to go forward with the index cards that are sort of trustees related right now that you've already submitted, and if you have more, wave it, and somebody will come grab it. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Bruce. Bill and Lanny, you may have already addressed this a little bit in your presentation, but just for the sake of making sure the questions are asked and answered, I'm going to repeat some of them as it is. Let's get out of the world of softballs right now and just get straight to the good one. Here, this question is, the presbytery has not been financially responsible in adjusting its staff to a decreasing budget. When will changes needed to get to a balanced budget be made? The presbytery should not squander funds received by exiting congregations.
That's a great question. That's a question I've been asking for the last 2.5 years. We've got to face reality at some point. But that goes back to the mission program that you're all talking about. When the 10 churches leave, in some ways there'll probably be a lot less need for missional support. I'm hoping, but we've got these NCDs. You guys have got these lists of all the new church developments. That's kind of where the future's going. So when we're specifically going to cut staffing, can't answer that. Staff Relations has looked at that, I'm sure, extensively, and we've had discussions every time we do the budgeting program. But, you know, being realistic, if we're going to cut $100,000, $200,000 out of the budget, we're going to have to take a long, hard look at all our expenditures. The biggest chunk in operations is staff. The second biggest chunk is new church development and other community programs. So we've got to make some tough choices. Trustees are not going to be making those choices. Staff Relations and Presbyterian Council will make most of them. We just have to pay the bills when they show up. We have to find the money to pay the bills.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm seeing a member of council picking up the mic, and given that Lanny has sort of suggested that council might have something to say about this, I'd invite Cheryl's response.
Yeah, when I think of I've been on council for the last number of years, so I am fully aware as a council member, as well as all of council, that the monies that we have spent, which has been over the amount of money we have brought in, has been done intentionally to invest in the presbytery as we, one, flip it, but also intentionally in terms of new church development and how we fund the future of the presbytery. So we are aware of those decisions, and in light of that, we currently need the staff that we have, and it's figuring out how in which to continue to do the myriad of things that council is responsible for in terms of the resources we have, and being more creative with it. Yes, we're looking at how to figure out how to trim some of the costs, but in the same sense, we have to always keep our eye on that mission, to be that continual learning environment and to work together to the support and health of the churches. And so it's just really important that I want to make it clear that although there has been a negative budget, it is because we have been investing in the future of the presbytery with full knowledge of that. And as we move forward, we'll be making other decisions on how we need to continue to invest in the future of the missional responsibility, which is in this geographic region. How do we promote healthy missional congregations and help us effectively engage the future? Because we all know that the world is changing so rapidly that the way that we have done church, whether you stay in Los Ranchos Presbytery or you're dismissed, the way in which we do church into the future is going to look dramatically different than the way it has looked in the past.
I'm going to ask the moderator's permission to go ahead and speak to that on my own merits. Yeah, okay. One of the things that occurs to me, and this is coming with the eyes of an outsider to what's been going on in Presbytery, whenever there is a matter of how do you make ends meet, there's both the side of trimming expenditures and there's also the side of raising income. And one of the things that I've noticed here, kind of with sort of dumb newbie eyes, is I don't really see a stewardship function going on within the presbytery as it currently exists. And I find myself thinking that in pairing and collaboration with what Bill is talking about better investing You know, that we have a lot of assets that perhaps could raise revenue, income, just by investing it more strategically. One of the places where speaking to the needs of the Presbytery mission may be better addressed is in articulating that mission in such a way that people who hear it want to pony up. So part of responsible management is going to be, yeah, we have to look at what expenses are irresponsible. But I think part of good church management, as all of you probably experience, is talking about, here's what we really think God is calling us to do. And we want to hear from your checkbooks how that's going to happen. And that message would not just be to this room, but I think to the whole group. And if the executive presbyter wants to tell me that I'm speaking out of turn and need to get back in my stated clerk's chair, I'm willing to do that. Some of these questions continue to follow on Bill's presentation, though I think that they may need broader panel participation in the answer. So this one comes, which is, what is the plan for the congregations that are not able to sustain themselves even after about 10 years of Los Ranchos cash infusion? I'm wondering if that's sort of an SCT question.
On the strategic coordinating team, there are subgroups called network teams, and they facilitate networks. And one of those networks is New Worshiping Communities network team. And so what they have done recently is, first of all, get a strong and clear view of all of our new worshiping communities and new church developments. And we've approved, as the SCT, we've approved a pathway to become an organized congregation of Los Ranchos Presbytery. And so it spelled out clearly what it looks like to become organized, which includes giving to the larger mission of the church. And so that has been defined now, and the New Worshiping Committees Network team also has a reporting process by which they're asking these new worshiping communities how their progress is going and when they plan to be organized, and also obviously ways that we can invest to help them get to that place of self-sufficiency. And so there is a process in place now. Of course, when you disband the Congregational and Presbytery Development Committee, as we did during the flip, there was a time there where those sorts of processes were not closely watched and were not carefully monitored. That's kind of regulatory language. They weren't nurtured in a very supportive, consistent manner. And that day's changed. Now we have a process, we have reporting, we have a team of people, the strategic coordinating team, that is monitoring that and requesting reports. And also with our Healthy Congregations Network team, another network team, we have very clear trends for each of your congregations, each of our congregations, regarding membership, regarding worship attendance, regarding your giving. And so now there's a group of people who are looking at that and saying, how can we maximize the resources we have in this presbytery? So in any major change of organizational structure, it takes a while to pick up some things that you may not have been quite as attentive to. We're attentive now, we're vigilant, and there's a team responsible. And so in the next few years, there's going to be that sort of consistent reporting back to the strategic coordinating team, and I think it's going to be very strategic in terms of how we can maximize the benefit of our investments.
Any other comments on that question? Okay. Lanny or Bill, how far in advance does Los Ranchos normally forecast its financial needs? And I might add to that question, how far in advance do you intend for Los Ranchos to forecast its financial once this revision to the way we do money kind of is fully in effect?
Prior to the operating budget of $930,000 that has been passed historically, we look at only a portion of the expenses for only 1 year at a time. There previously was no budgeting for the 600,000 or so program expenses, and there was no analysis of the balance sheet to see how many years of withdrawals from dedicated accounts would support whatever the ongoing ministry was. Starting last fall, that changed. And the Team 5 that are working together is planning a 5-year forecast, with the first 3 being the ones of the first 3 years, 15, 16, and 17, is where our focus is. It will, by detailed line item, address both the operating expenses and the program expenses. It will also look at the balance sheet, and for each of our dedicated accounts, we'll see how many years of funding before those funds are depleted.
We have several cards here that all hover around the same constellation of questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just by articulating in my own head what the big picture question is to you all, and then check the cards to make sure there aren't any kind of details on those that I've overlooked in the general question and in the answers. The general question is, what's going to happen with the money? I mean, let's assume that each of the churches writes a check, in addition to whatever else is involved in the joint resolution by the time it's all over. With that check, what's going to happen to the money then? And in particular, some of the interests or concerns include that it be used for mission and kingdom growth, and that they're looking for an assurance in that respect. And in another one, the concern or desire is that it not be used to either sit in the bank or pay deficits. So can it be earmarked for mission and new church development? I don't want the answers here to get hung up on mission and new church development specifically, because I think there are a lot of pieces to where's the money going to go that need to be answered, even if they're not specifically addressed. But I would also urge you to make sure you do hit on the what about kind of kingdom growth issues. So I'm seeing Cheryl. Oh. Okay, so the council leadership is telling the trustees that they should begin answering the question. Okay, let's start with Cheryl then.
Okay, well, the simple answer is, what's going to be done with the money is it's going to be up to the presbytery. The presbytery being whoever is currently in the leadership as pastors and elders, they're the ones who would determine what would be done with this money that might come from the dismissals. Just like right now we have the property policy, and you'll have to tell me when that was instituted. The church, in other words, if a church property is sold, it goes into the church, there's a property policy, and it says so much is used for these different percentages. That was a presbytery decision. That's those gatherings where we all vote on a policy, and that's how the money is determined. So that's kind of a short answer on how it would be spent.
Yeah, we have a policy that I think many of you have been involved with. It's actually passed in November of 2006, where when we sell a piece of church property, we break the money up into 4 basic pools. 50% of that money is used for new church development. 10% of it is used to help with pastor compensation. 10% of it is used for leadership development. And the remaining 30% is used by the trustees to support churches in need. In other words, where their buildings are in trouble, they may need help with a new roof. We now actually have a loan program where we're trying to help churches maintain their property if they're in financial difficulty. I'm going to take off a little bit from what Forrest's question was. I know I've heard at the break, and I've heard from Forrest some questions about if money is received from the sale of church properties, are we going to upstream it to the denomination? excuse me, Senate or General Assembly on a few properties. They've borrowed money over the past years from Senate or GA in the form of loans. Those have to be paid off, and we will pay them off. The remaining money stays here in Los Ranchos.
Anyone else? Okay.
I would just add, just as a point of information, that on our website, there's a little button on the right side of losranchos.org, and it's called Resources. And this policy can be found under the Resources section. So if you just scroll down, you'll see the sale of church property policy, along with all of our policies that help us decide how to use our resources. So this is always available to you, and we're glad to make them available. We may have more than 50 people here, so we may run out of the paper version. But please go to our website, because we want to make sure that everyone's in the know.
I'd like to add, speaking as the stated clerk and interpreter of the policy, one kind of adjustment to what's been said here. I mean, one is, yes, it's absolutely right, the presbytery will decide what happens with the money. And two, it's absolutely right that if the presbytery doesn't make any different explicit decisions, that the property, sale of church property policy would apply in many of these instances. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that it always belongs to the presbytery to override its own policy by a proper vote. And so if your team comes with a provision saying, okay, we're turning this property into cash such that we give it to the presbytery in fulfillment of the trust clause, and we're inclined actually to give more if we know that that money is going to certain functions rather than other functions, it may be that the JDT as a whole thinks this is a good idea. It is fine for the JDT to propose that kind of thing to the presbytery to see whether the presbytery will nibble at that bait or not. The important thing to understand, though, is that it will belong to the presbytery to decide whether that kind of proposal is acceptable to them or not. And the way that decision will get made is by vote on the floor of presbytery when the entire JDT proposal comes. Is that clear enough? And clear enough to you who spoke that it's not a contradiction, but a fleshing out? Just on the question of money and kind of where is the money going to go, can I see the hands that posed questions like that doing this thing to let me know if they've all kind of been covered as far as you posing those? I'm seeing a yes. Okay. All right. Another one of these easy kind of questions. Isn't there a conflict of interest to have current staff members on the bodies within Los Ranchos that are making budget decisions about staffing?
That would be me. In some ways, I stand with one foot in a church that probably will be dismissed, and the other foot in Los Ranchos, where I love both. And just trying to do what is right, trying to help Los Ranchos by bringing to it a financial perspective that is not had, and trying to be as absolutely neutral as possible, to be basing information on facts as best as we can dig those facts out and document it. And in reality, the financial presentation that the trustees are going through is a roadmap that says here's where we should go, but the decisions aren't going to be made by the trustees. The decisions are going to be made more by strategic coordinating team, by council, property management, other things like that.
I'll just speak from my own personal experience and being in a number of different organizations where staffing, budget cuts had to be made. when you say that it's maybe a conflict of interest that the staff is involved, the staff actually probably has the most intimate knowledge of what the finances are. I can speak back to when I was in a downsizing in a corporate America, when I was downsizing in my own local church, my own position. I was involved in that decision because that is what was best for making it a win-win situation for both the church and for myself as a staff person. So if I would have not been involved in that, because it would have been considered a conflict of interest as the pastor of the local church, I think they would have missed an opportunity for us to really move forward in ministry together. And so I would say asking the staff to be involved in helping us plan the future is really a win-win situation for the presbytery versus keeping them in the dark. That's what happened often in the corporate setting, and it was devastating. And I would not want us as a body of ministry to do things that are devastating to our own staff. I think they need to be thoroughly involved in any future decisions that are being made for their health and our health and for kingdom health.
Any other responses? Okay. This may be a quick one. Have the trustees established a target for each congregation seeking dismissal? And by target, I'm going to interpret that word as meaning an amount of money we hope each church will write the check for.
No.
How are you incorporating the aging of the presbytery into your financial planning? I suspect that in 10 years, at least half of the pastors will be retired and half of the congregational membership will be retired or in heaven. The Presbytery Foundation has an excellent program in estate planning.
One of the slides I showed you in the PowerPoint were the demographics of Los Ranchos, 18,000 members going down about 8% over the last 5 years. It's true that our presbytery is aging. Part of the strategic plan is to say, what can we do with programs like New Beginnings to revitalize some of those churches that are trending downward? Part of our plan is to say, what can be done with other kinds of programs, planting new churches or fresh expressions that may reach out to the demographic that doesn't have gray hair. That's part of the planning process. Don't have answers, but we're certainly conscious of it and asking the questions.
To continue on Bill's comment, the future of churches will look very different from churches of the past. Part of the planning for the future is engaging young leaders, especially as a generation of ministers is retiring, has been and is retiring now in rather rapid succession. Young candidates are looking at the future of the church and expecting it to be completely different. The questions that candidates graduating from seminary, our sharpest candidates, are asking is not so much anymore, where can I find the best job in a church that will position me for getting a better job? Candidates are asking, what can I do to make a livelihood so that I can do ministry also? Candidates are assuming that they will be engaged in their communities as pastors in very different ways, that they may be part-time, they may be self-supporting. One of the things that is happening in our presbytery is that we are getting, and I am just thrilled to continually be getting contacted by candidates, amazingly sharp candidates, the tops of their classes graduating from seminaries, who are interested in coming to explore with us because they have seen how we have been creative in launching new, different kinds of ministries that other presbyteries wouldn't consider. So the future will look very different. It will have very different business models. But we are preparing for that, even though we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But the kind of overhead per congregation that we've seen in the past will shift too. It will cost us something to make the transition, but we are working on that transition.
One more regarding this portion of the presentation, then we'll take a break. Again, I'm suggesting for about 6 or 7 minutes at the most. In the trustees' $1 million budgeted over 5 years and presented at the November meeting, so I'm going to do some interpretation here. The Financial Futures Task Force included in its recommendation the idea of $1 million of dismissal money going to certain work within the presbytery. In that $1 million, is it intended that those funds come from the property value equation developed as a part of any joint solution? For the question asker, if I'm going to change some of the language just to make it simpler, and if I end up twisting the question, let me know, okay? My sense is that what this is saying is Financial Futures Task Force made a recommendation that $1 million would go to certain purposes within the presbytery according to the recommendations of the Financial Futures Task Force. Trustees concurred in that, council concurred in that, presbytery says looks good. And one of the things of the task force was sort of this is assuming, of course, that $1 million would come in. If it's less, then the number will be less. And the question is that money, if I'm understanding the question right, is that money coming from the settlements, the joint resolutions, that $1 million? If nobody raises their hand to correct my interpretation, I'm going to interpret you as agreeing with it. Okay. Is the question clear enough to be answered? Okay.
The $1 million was a ballpark number that the committee, the Financial Futures Task Force, looked at down the road 3 to 5 years of funding for the presbytery, and then deficits. We're still looking at the deficits, which Bill has delineated in his slide presentation. It was a wild guess. We don't know if it's coming from specific churches. We didn't develop a list of the churches and say we wanted dollars from this church or this church. It was just a wild guess. The teams will determine what that number turns out to be, not us.
Cheryl, do you want to add anything?
Try to figure out how he answered the question.
I answer your question, Bill. Did I miss it?
Let's put it back to the people. Okay, that would be a no.
It's not,
No, I didn't answer it.
it's not.
Yeah.
I would just say that the Financials Task Force, when we were together, Lanny and I were both on it, that, along with others, that we knew that there were going to be financial settlements as churches were dismissed from Los Ranchos Presbytery. And looking at the projection of what we were going to need in the next 3 to 5 years to make the transition so that we could reposition ourselves, so that we could be missional, strategic, and this learning and teaching organization that we have been talking about, that we felt that it would be most helpful to, out of whatever the settlement dollars were, that $1 million of it be designated to the ability to continue operating as currently sized from a staffing perspective. And so that's where that number came from. And as Lanny said, if there's more money than that, we, as a presbytery, have only agreed to $1 million. If there's less money than that, then there would not be money available. So it was really thinking about the transition period in the next 3 to 5 years and how we are going to make the changes.
Going back to Forrest's earlier comment too, if some of the churches who are dismissed come up with a plan for the use of the funds that are used as part of the dismissal process for new church development or missional, and the presbytery approves those plans, it could drastically change the $1 million projection. Okay?
All right. Most of the remaining trustees-related questions and money-related questions, really I'm categorizing in the sense of what is the process going forward in the dismissal work that we're doing. So I'm going to suggest now that we've kind of brought a wrap to this portion of the day. So I'm going to encourage, let's do 8 minutes, reconvene at 11:15. That will give me time to set up my PowerPoint, give you time to get your extra donut. We'll be returning, when you come back, to a presentation on the trust clause and how it affects the work that we're doing in the weeks and months ahead. So if you have specific questions about that you haven't put in on index cards yet, go ahead and work on them now.